You're being abused, you call 911, law enforcement shows up, you end up arrested. One of the main reasons I think this happens is because law enforcement is not trained on the fact that when they show up to a domestic abuse call, things are going to look a little different than any other type of violent crime call. The perpetrator of the violence is going to be very cool, calm, collected with it, seems like a totally reasonable, normal person because they are in complete control of their anger and they are filtering it towards the person they are abusing. That's how abuse works. They are choosing to direct their anger and their violence toward one person in order to subject them to abuse and to gain power and control over them. The other side of this is the person they have been abusing. They have been intimidating them, manipulating them, pushing their buttons to the point that maybe they've lashed out. And now law enforcement has shown up and the survivor, the victim of the crime, is completely frantic and out of control. They are pacing, they are yelling, they are crying. Law enforcement shows up and they see one person who's acting totally quote unquote normal and one person who's not. And so who are they going to arrest? They're going to arrest the person that's acting what they consider to be crazy or out of control. The thing is, that is part of the abuse, right? The abuser acts cool, calm, collected, pushes their buttons, pushes until the person who's being abused starts to lash out and act quote unquote crazy or out of control. And then the abuser can point to them, look at the cops and say, see, I told you she's crazy, right? That's how it works. Another thing I think that causes the survivor to be arrested or the victim to be arrested over the abuser is that scratch marks, which are usually self-defense marks, right? They're scratching at someone's face as they're being strangled or something like that, right? Those scratch marks show up right away. They're bloody, they look bad. Bruising, on the other hand, which is often what happens from abuse, takes a while to show up. Bruises don't usually show up right away unless they're very extreme and you bruise easily, right? So law enforcement shows up, they see this frantic person acting wild and crazy, right? Quote unquote. And she has no injuries on her that they can see, no visible injuries. And then they see this guy who's like totally with it, totally calm, and he's got bloody scratch marks on his face. They arrest the victim. Another thing I see is that survivors or victims of the crime will call law enforcement. Law enforcement will show up if they can actually assess correctly the perpetrator and the victim and they see the abuser has caused the violence. Sometimes the survivor will ask that they not press charges. And that's totally fine. This is not me placing judgment on anyone. What ends up happening is that if that happens several times, law enforcement will finally come out and say, look, if you call us one more time, you're going to jail. That's not what they should do, but that's what they do. I've heard it. I hear it all the time. This document is from the hearing before the Select Committee on Children, Youth, and Families House of Representatives from May 20th of 1991. As you can see way up at the top, the title of this document is On the Front Lines, Police Stress and Family Well-Being. And this covers a lot of things. One of the things it covers is the rate of domestic abuse within law enforcement. I think many people have heard this number that law enforcement has a 40% spousal abuse rate, right? And I think it's very important to go to the source of where this came from. There's two sources that the number 40% came from, and this is the first one. And it says approximately 40% of law enforcement said that in the last 6 months prior to the survey, they had behaved violently towards their spouse or children. Domestic abuse is severely underreported by victims or survivors. It is definitely underreported by abusers because abusers are not inclined to admit that they are at fault and they have been abusive, right? That's how the abuse functions, is that they never acknowledge that they are the problem. We have a 40% self-reported domestic abuse rate within law enforcement. What that means in context of this video is that when law enforcement shows up to a domestic abuse call, there is a chance that one or both or all of the law enforcement officers that show up have engaged in or committed domestic abuse themselves. And part of being an abuser is minimizing, denying, and blaming. So, what are they going to do? They're going to help the abuser minimize, deny, and blame because that's what they do in their own relationships. It is normal for them for someone to be violent and abusive and for it to be blamed on the other person. It is justified and normal in their minds because they have such a high rate of doing it themselves. And that's whoever admits to doing it themselves. I think the solution here is that law enforcement needs to be trained. They need to be trained on the dynamics of a domestic abuse call, and they also need to be treated for their own domestic abuse problem. Abuse is a learned behavior. They are learning it from each other. If we don't pull it out at its root, it's not going to get better, and they're going to keep arresting survivors and blaming victims.